The handcuffs were still on when I heard the first scream. I want to be precise about that, because everything that came after the ship, the fortress, the disappearance, began with my wrists locked behind my back in a windowless cabin on the container vessel MV Capella Star, 12 nautical miles off the coast of Galveston, Texas. Not because I was brave, not because I had a plan, because I was a criminal being transported, and the world ended while I was in custody. My name is Leo Barrows, 41 years old, former portfolio manager at a Houston-based commodities firm, former member of a country club, former husband, current federal fugitive, apprehended 36 hours earlier at a marina in Kemah after 14 months on the run. The charge was wire fraud. $47 million moved through fictitious accounts across 3 continents. The FBI agent who arrested me, a calm woman named Diaz, told me I'd get between 8 and 12 years. She said it like she was reading a weather forecast. They put me on the Capella Star because the federal courthouse in Corpus Christi was handling my arraignment, and the fastest way to move me quietly was aboard a cargo vessel already scheduled for coastal transit. 2 U.S. Marshals accompanied me. The first was a broad man named Kowalski, who chewed gum with his mouth open and called me Money Man like it was a diagnosis. The second was a woman named Voss, who never spoke to me directly, but watched me with a particular focus of someone who had lost money in the crash of '08 and never forgiven anyone who resembled its architects. I didn't try to explain what I'd actually done. Innocent men explain. Guilty men wait. The Capella Star was a Panamax-class container ship, 965 feet long, stacked 6 high with intermodal containers, crewed by 23 merchant sailors of mixed nationality. I was kept in a spare officer's cabin on the accommodation block's 2nd deck, port side. The cabin had a bolted bunk, a stainless toilet, and a porthole the size of a salad plate. The handcuffs were regulation double-locked, hinged, connected to a waist chain. I could sit, I could stand, I couldn't reach my own face. The scream came at 11:40 p.m. on our second night out. It didn't sound like fear. It sounded like surprise, the kind of vocalization a person makes when a door opens into them, sharp and indignant before the brain catches up. It came from above. Then it stopped. Then something hit the deck overhead with a wet, structural thud, like a bag of sand dropped from scaffolding. I listened. The ship moved beneath me with its usual slow roll. The engine hummed. Nothing followed for 90 seconds. Then Kowalski's radio crackled. Someone on the bridge was speaking in rapid Tagalog. I don't speak Tagalog, but panic doesn't require translation. The cadence was wrong, too fast, too high, interrupted by something I could hear through the radio and through the deck simultaneously. A second scream, this one longer, Dopplering as though the person was moving while screaming, followed by a sound I will not describe except to say that it ended the scream mid-syllable. Kowalski was on his feet. He looked at Voss. Voss looked at the door. "Stay with him," Kowalski said. "Both of us should stay with him." He left. The door latched. Voss pulled her sidearm and stood with her back against the bulkhead, watching the door like it owed her money. I said, "What's happening?" She said nothing. I said, "If this ship has a problem, I need to not be chained to a pipe." She said, "You need to be exactly where you are." That was the last normal sentence anyone spoke aboard the Capella Star. The next sound was running. Multiple boots on steel, moving fast, not coordinated the scatter pattern of people fleeing rather than responding. Then a burst of gunfire, 3 rounds, the flat crack of a handgun, not a rifle. Then a longer silence than any of the previous ones. Then Kowalski's voice on the radio, not speaking to us, broadcasting to anyone. "We have a medical emergency on the main deck. Multiple crew injured. Requesting anyone on the bridge acknowledge." No one acknowledged. Voss keyed her radio. "Kowalski, status." "Static." "Kowalski, status." The ship rolled. The porthole showed nothing but black ocean. She looked at me for the first time like I was a person. Voss unlocked the cuffs 17 minutes after Kowalski stopped answering. I know the exact duration because I counted seconds the way I used to count basis points compulsively, substituting arithmetic for the feeling underneath it. She didn't explain. She didn't ask permission from a chain of command that no longer existed on this vessel. She reached behind me, keyed the lock, and the cuffs fell onto the bunk with a sound like a drawer closing. "If you run," she said, "I will not chase you. I will shoot you in the back and file the paperwork in whatever port still processes paperwork. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Good. You're going to carry the emergency bag. You're going to stay behind me. You are not going to speak unless I ask you a question." She handed me a red duffel from the locker, a go bag the marshals had packed. It weighed maybe 30 pounds. I slung it over my shoulder. My wrists ached where the cuffs had been. I flexed my fingers. They worked. That was all I needed to know. Voss opened the cabin door and checked both directions of the corridor. The accommodation block on a Panamax vessel is a 7-story superstructure at the stern crew quarters, galley, bridge, offices, all stacked above the engine room. The corridors are narrow, fluorescent, painted in institutional cream. They look like a hospital designed by someone who hated patients. The corridor was empty. The fluorescence buzzed. Somewhere below, the engine continued its steady thrum, indifferent to whatever was happening in the human spaces above it. We moved aft toward the interior stairwell. Voss led with her weapon up a Sig Sauer P229, the standard marshal's sidearm. She moved well. Whatever her feelings about white-collar criminals, her feet knew how to cross a threshold without breaking rhythm. We made it one flight up before we found the first body. He was a crew member Filipino, mid-20s, wearing a boiler suit with the ship's logo stitched on the chest. He was lying face down on the landing between decks 2 and 3. There was blood beneath him, spreading in a slow oval across the non-skid steel. His neck was wrong, not broken open. Something had bitten through the lateral tissue from the trapezius to the jaw, removing a section the size of a fist. The wound was ragged, torn, not cut. No weapon I recognized could produce that geometry. Voss checked his pulse. I watched her fingers press his wrist and hold. She looked up at me and shook her head. Not a performance of grief. A data point. "We're going to the bridge," she said. "Stay close." We stepped over him. I want to record that I felt something, a compression in my chest, a heat behind my eyes. But I'm going to be honest instead. What I felt was calculation. I looked at the wound and thought, that wasn't a knife. That wasn't a bullet. Whatever made that was using its mouth. And the calculation that followed was the same one I'd been running my entire career, just applied to a different portfolio. What is the risk exposure? How fast is it moving? Where is the exit? We climbed 2 more flights without finding anyone alive or dead. The stairwell smelled like diesel and copper. On the 4th floor landing, Voss stopped. She held up a fist, the tactical signal for halt. I stopped. From above came a sound. Wet, rhythmic, pressureless, like someone chewing with their mouth open. It was coming from the corridor that led to the officers' mess. Voss looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us said what the sound was. She pointed to a fire door on our left, a cross corridor that would bypass the mess and route us to the bridge stairwell from the starboard side. I nodded. We went through the fire door. The starboard corridor was darker, one of the fluorescent tubes had failed, and the remaining one pulsed in an arrhythmic flicker. Halfway down, a cabin door was open. Inside, I could see a bunk with sheets pulled to the floor, a desk lamp still on, a coffee mug overturned. The room was empty. But on the desk, a laptop was open to a news page. I couldn't read the headline from the corridor, but I saw the banner, read, "Full width, the kind reserved for events that outscale the formatting." Voss saw it too. She paused for half a second. Then she kept moving. We reached the bridge stairwell and climbed. The bridge door was locked from the inside, a heavy steel affair with a deadbolt and a crash bar. Voss knocked with the base of her palm. 3 sharp strikes. "U.S. Marshal, open the door." Nothing. She knocked again. "This is Deputy Marshal Voss, U.S. Marshal Service. I have identification. Open this door." A voice from inside mail, accented shaking. "How many are with you?" "1. A prisoner in my custody. We're unarmed, aside from my service weapon." A long pause. Then the deadbolt turned. The man who opened the door was the ship's second officer. His name was Aurelio. He was holding a fire axe in one hand and a satellite phone in the other, and the phone's screen was dark. Aurelio let us in and locked the door immediately. Deadbolt, crash bar, then a length of cargo chain he'd threaded through the handles and padlocked. His hands were shaking badly enough that the chain rattled against the steel. He didn't look at my face. He looked at Voss's weapon. "How many rounds?" he asked. "Enough," Voss said. "Where's the captain?" "Dead, on the main deck. He went down with the bosun when we heard the first. When the crew started..." Aurelio stopped. He set the fire axe on the chart table and pressed both palms flat against the surface, steadying himself the way a person steadies a table, as though his own body were furniture threatening to tip. "There are 9 of them. Maybe 10. I lost count." "9 of what?" He looked at her. "You saw the one on the stairs." Voss said nothing. "They were crew. Ramirez, Delgado, the 2 engine cadets. They got sick fast, an hour, maybe less. Fever, then seizures, then they stopped. And then they didn't stay stopped." I set the duffel bag down. The bridge of the Capella Star was wide, glass-fronted, equipped with twin radar screens, an ECDIS chart display, and a row of communication consoles. Through the windows, the Gulf of Mexico stretched flat and black in every direction, featureless except for the red and green running lights of a distant vessel on the horizon. The sky was overcast, starless. We were alone in every direction that mattered. "The sat phone," I said. Voss looked at me. I looked at Aurelio. "You tried to call?" "Coast Guard, Port Authority, Vessel Traffic Service, Company Office in Hamburg." He picked up the satellite phone and held it out like evidence. "Every call connects. No one answers. I reached an automated system in New Orleans that told me to shelter in place and await further instructions. That was 4 hours ago. The instructions never came." Voss holstered her weapon and walked to the communication console. She tried the VHF radio channel 16, the international distress frequency. She transmitted a mayday. She waited. She transmitted again. The response was not silence. It was worse than silence. The channel was saturated with transmissions, overlapping, fragmentary, dozens of vessels broadcasting simultaneously in English, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic. Distress calls stacked on top of distress calls. No one was coordinating. No one was answering. Everyone was calling, No one was listening. She turned the volume down but left the radio on. The chorus of emergencies became a murmur, like a party in another room where every guest was drowning. "How many crews survived?" I asked Aurelio. "Up here, me. The third engineer, Kwesi, is in the engine control room. I spoke to him on the internal phone 20 minutes ago. He sealed himself in when the first one came through the engine casing door. He's alone. The galley cook, Mrs. Park, was in the cold storage when it started. She locked herself in the freezer. I told her to stay." "That's 4, I said. "Counting us, 6. There may be others. The accommodation block has 42 compartments. I don't know who's alive behind which door." "And the infected, they're in the accommodation block?" "Mostly the main deck. Some in the corridors below. I watched from here." He pointed to the bridge wing door, which opened onto an exterior walkway with a clear sight line down the length of the ship. "I watched Delgado chase Fonseca across the container tops. Fonseca fell between the stacks. Delgado went in after him." I absorbed that. The container stacks on a loaded Panamax are steel canyons 6 containers high, narrow alleys between rows, no ladders, no light. If infected crew were down in those gaps, they were contained by geometry. But the accommodation block was different. The accommodation block was a building. Corridors, doorways, stairwells. The infected could move freely inside it. "The engine," I said. Aurelio looked at me. "The engine is still running. Who's controlling the heading?" "Autopilot. We were on a programmed course to Corpus Christi. ETA was..." He checked the ECDIS. 14 hours ago. We should have been there already. But I changed the waypoint." "To where?" "Nowhere." I pointed us south and set the speed to dead slow. I didn't want to hit land. I didn't want to arrive anywhere. I looked at the chart display. The Capella star was a blue triangle, inching south-southeast into open Gulf water. Behind us, the Texas coast was a thin brown line receding on the edge of the radar range. Ahead was nothing but depth contours and empty ocean until the Yucatan Shelf. "You did the right thing," I said. Voss cut in. "He doesn't need your assessment. He needs to know the heading was correct." She stared at me with the particular contempt reserved for prisoners who start acting like participants. I held her gaze. I'd spent 14 months running from people who looked at me exactly like that. It wasn't new. "The ship is our asset," I said. "It's self-contained, it's mobile, and nothing on land can reach us if we stay offshore. The infected can't swim." "You don't know that," Voss said. "They're using their mouths to attack. They chased a man across container tops. They're not swimming." Aurelio said quietly, "He's right. I need to explain something about cargo ships that most people never consider, because it determined everything that followed. A Panamax container vessel is not a boat. It is a floating industrial complex. The Capella Star displaced 52,000 tons. Its deck area, counting the container bays, was roughly equivalent to 3 football fields. The accommodation block alone, the superstructure at the stern, had 7 levels, each with a network of corridors, cabins, utility rooms, and stairwells. The engine room was a cathedral of steel 4 stories tall. Below the waterline were ballast tanks, fuel bunkers, freshwater generators, and void spaces that had never been intended for human habitation, but could fit a person easily. The point is this: we were not trapped on a lifeboat. We were trapped inside a small city. And like any city, it had neighborhoods, some safe, some lethal, most unknown. Clearing it would not be a single dramatic sweep. It would be a systematic, room-by-room, deck-by-deck labor that would take days and carry risk at every door. That first night, we didn't clear anything. We consolidated. Voss and I stayed on the bridge with Aurelio. Quasi remained sealed in the engine control room 200 feet below us. Mrs. Park stayed in the freezer. The internal phone system still worked a hard-wired network independent of any satellite or shore connection, and we established check-in times. Every 30 minutes, every living person calls the bridge. If you miss a check-in, we assume the worst. Nobody missed that first night. Nobody slept either. At dawn, the Gulf turned silver and flat. I stood on the bridge wing and looked down the length of the ship for the first time in full light. The container stacks ran forward in orderly rows, their corrugated steel sides painted in the logos of shipping companies. Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, Evergreen, MSC. They looked normal, ordinary. The mundane infrastructure of global commerce, completely indifferent to the fact that global commerce had ended. I could see two of them from the bridge wing. Infected, former crew. They were standing on the main deck near the port side break, motionless, facing different directions. One was shirtless, his skin darkened with dried blood that wasn't his. The other still wore a hard hat. They weren't moving. They weren't looking at each other. They stood like appliances left on in an empty room, powered but purposeless until stimulated. "They're dormant," I said. Voss came to the rail beside me. She looked down. Her expression didn't change, but her breathing did a single controlled inhale through her nose, held, released. "Below decks," she said. "That's where the rest will be." Aurelio counted 9. "We can see 2. That leaves 7 in the accommodation block or the container alleys." "What are you proposing?" I turned to her. "We clear the ship, deck by deck. We drive them off the edges, or we seal them into compartments they can't escape. Then we control everything: food, water, fuel, communications. We make this vessel a closed system." "With what? Your finance degree?" "With doors." I pointed down. Every compartment on this ship has a steel door with a dogging handle. Engine room, stores, cabins. They're all designed to be watertight or fire-resistant. We don't need weapons. We need to understand the architecture and use it. Voss looked at me the way analysts look at a spreadsheet they suspect has been manipulated, searching for the embedded error she knew was there, because a man like me had built it. "Quasi knows the ship," I continued. "Aurelio knows the systems. Mrs. Park has been aboard for 2 years and knows every storage compartment. And you know how to move through a hostile structure without dying. I'm the only one here with nothing to contribute except the willingness to open doors. Prisoners don't lead operations. I'm not leading. I'm volunteering to be the first person through every hatch." She studied me for a long time. I didn't flinch. Not because I was brave, but because I'd spent my professional life sitting across from people who were trying to determine whether I was lying. I was good at the silence. "Fine," she said. "But the chain stays in my pocket. If this ship stabilizes, you go back in cuffs." "Agreed." I meant it. That was the strange thing. I genuinely, at that moment, intended to go back into custody if civilization reassembled itself. The fraud was real. The guilt was real. I had stolen $47 million, and I deserved whatever term a judge assigned. But the judge was in Corpus Christi, and Corpus Christi wasn't answering the phone. We began the clearing operation at 0800 on what I designated Day 3, counting from my arrest, not the outbreak, because I didn't know when the outbreak had actually started. The world's chronology was no longer available to me. Only the ship's clock mattered. The plan was simple in concept. Start at the top of the accommodation block and work down sealing each cleared deck behind us with chain and padlock. Voss would lead with her weapon. I would follow with a length of steel pipe Aurelio had taken from an emergency damage control locker. Aurelio would remain on the bridge monitoring internal cameras. The Capella Star had a CCTV system covering the main corridors and exterior decks, though several cameras were offline. Deck 7, the bridge level, already secure, cleared. Deck 6, officers' quarters, the captain's cabin, the ship's office. Voss and I moved through in 12 minutes. Every cabin was empty. The captain's quarters had a half-eaten meal on the desk and a family photograph face down. I didn't turn it over. Voss sealed the stairwell door behind us with a padlock and marked it with a strip of orange tape from the emergency kit. Deck 5. Senior crew quarters and the ship's hospital, a single-bed infirmary with a locked pharmacy cabinet. Also empty, but here we found evidence. Cabin 503 had a smashed porthole, the reinforced glass spider-webbed but intact. Something had hit it from the inside, repeatedly, with enough force to deform the frame. The bunk was overturned. The mattress was on the floor, soaked dark. No body. Whatever had happened in this room, the occupant, or what the occupant became, had eventually gotten out through the door, which stood open. Voss photographed the room with her phone. Not for evidence, for inventory. She was building a map of what had happened before we arrived on this level. Reading the ship's trauma the way an adjuster reads a car wreck. Direction of impact, sequence of failures, probable velocity at the moment of collision. Deck 4, junior officer quarters and the laundry. We found our first contained infected here, and the encounter rewrote every assumption I'd been operating on. The laundry was a narrow room, amidships industrial washers bolted to the deck, a folding table, a drying rack. The door was a standard interior type, not watertight, held shut by a simple lever handle. As we approached, I heard it. A rhythmic bumping, soft, persistent, like someone gently knocking from inside a closet. Voss positioned herself left of the door. I stood right, pipe raised. She reached for the handle. "Wait," I said. She paused. "We don't open it. We confirm it's contained. We reinforce the door. We move on. There's no reason to engage." She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression. Not respect, not yet. But the recalibration that happens when a person you've categorized demonstrates a capacity you didn't allocate to them. "The handle's not dogged," she said. "It'll work its way out eventually. Then we'd dog it from outside." I pointed to the lever mechanism. Standard marine hardware. A quarter turn would lock the handle in the closed position. I reached across, turned the lever, and felt the latch seat. The bumping continued inside, but the door held. We marked it with orange tape. One infected contained Deck 4 laundry. Aurelio logged it on the bridge. Deck 3, crew quarters, galley, mess hall, recreation room. This was the most populated level 16 cabins, each capable of housing 2 crew members. Voss and I worked through them one at a time, announcing ourselves at each door, waiting, listening, then entering. 11 were empty. 2 were locked from the inside. With no response to our calls, we marked them and moved on, unable to determine if the occupants were hiding, dead, or turned. 1 was open with signs of struggle and no occupant. 1 contained a body. She was in cabin 3-11. A woman in her 50s, still in her bunk, the sheets pulled to her chin. She looked asleep. There was no visible wound, no blood, no sign of violence. Her skin had a gray undertone, and her eyes were closed. Voss checked for a pulse and found none. We looked at each other across the body and shared the same unspoken calculation. Does she come back? How long? I asked. Aurelio said an hour. Fever, seizure, stop, restart. We didn't know when she'd died. We didn't know the interval. We backed out of the cabin, closed the door, dogged the handle, taped it red instead of orange, our improvised code for dead, but uncertain, and kept moving. The galley was clear. Mrs. Park's freezer was on this deck, and we finally opened it. She came out shivering, furious, and holding a cleaver. She was 63 years old, 4'11", and she looked at me with the immediate suspicion of a woman who could tell I didn't belong on this ship in any legitimate capacity. "Who is this?" she asked Voss. "Cargo," Voss said. By the end of day 3, we had cleared the accommodation block down to deck 2. The tally: 3 confirmed infected, sealed in compartments. 1 unconfirmed, dead, sealed in a cabin. 2 locked cabins with unknown status. And the 2 dormant figures on the main deck who hadn't moved since dawn. Queshy remained in the engine control room and reported no activity in the engine spaces. We gathered on the bridge at dusk, 4 of us in the same room for the first time. Aurelio spread a deck plan across the chart table. Voss laid her weapon on the console. Mrs. Park set a pot of rice and canned mackerel on the radar hood, which she had heated on the galley stove during our brief occupation of deck 3. We ate standing up. I had spent my career in conference rooms, presenting allocation strategies to people whose money I was about to mismanage. I knew how groups formed decisions. I knew who spoke first, who deferred, who tested loyalty by disagreeing publicly. What I watched forming around that chart table was not a committee, it was a crew. And crews operate on a different physics than committees. Committees distribute authority, crews concentrate it. The question was where. Voss spoke first. She outlined what we'd cleared, what remained, and what the threat picture looked like. She was precise, sequential, and devoid of emotion. She spoke like a person writing a report she expected to file. Tomorrow we clear the main deck and the forward spaces. Containers we leave alone, the alleys are too narrow and we can't seal them. We secure the external stairways to the accommodation block and create a perimeter that separates the superstructure from the cargo area. Then we address provisions. Aurelio nodded. Mrs. Park nodded. They looked at me. I was the unknown variable, the prisoner whose cuffs were off, the white-collar stranger eating their rice. Provisions aren't the constraint, I said. The ship's stores will sustain 4 people for months. Water isn't either. We have a freshwater evaporator running off engine heat. The constraint is fuel. We're burning diesel at dead slow speed. Queshy can give us the consumption rate. But at some point, this engine stops, and we become a drift platform. Before that happens, we need to decide where we're going. We're not going anywhere, Voss said. We're staying offshore until contact is reestablished. Contact with whom? Coast Guard, Navy, FEMA, any federal authority with jurisdiction. Marshal Voss, you've been monitoring Channel 16 for 18 hours. What have you heard? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. We'd all heard it, the overlapping maydays, the unanswered calls, the automated recordings on loops broadcasting from stations that had been abandoned. The architecture of response had collapsed. There was no jurisdiction because there was no shore. I'm not proposing we land, I said. I'm proposing we stop. Kill the engine, deploy the anchor if depth allows, and conserve fuel for repositioning only. We turn this ship into a stationary platform, and we make it livable. A stationary platform in the open Gulf. A stationary platform that no infected can reach, that generates its own water, that has months of food in the stores, and that can move under its own power if conditions change. We don't need to go anywhere. We need to stop pretending anywhere exists. The silence that followed was the kind I recognized from boardrooms. The moment after someone says the number no one wanted to calculate. And every face in the room rearranges itself around the new math. Aurelio spoke. The anchorage depth here is too great. But if we move to the continental shelf edge, 80-90 fathoms, we could anchor with the emergency gear. Or I can hold position with dynamic maneuvering at minimal fuel cost. Do it, Mrs. Park said. Everyone looked at her. She was scraping the last of the rice into Aurelio's bowl, not looking up. The boy is right. There is no port. Stop the ship. Fix what we have. The boy. I was 41. She called me the boy. And in that sentence, she rearranged the hierarchy of the bridge, without raising her voice. Aurelio was the navigator. Voss was the gun. I was the boy with the plan. And Mrs. Park was the adult. We killed the main engine at 9 p.m. The sudden silence was absolute. A vibration that had been constant since I'd boarded simply vanished. And the ship settled into the water with a new heaviness, like a held breath released. The Capella Star began to drift on the current, rotating slowly, her bow swinging south. The GPS showed our position, 27.2 degrees north, 93.8 degrees west. Open Gulf, deep water, nothing on radar for 40 miles. I stood on the bridge wing and listened to the ocean. No engine, no radio chatter, no shore lights on any horizon. Just the water against the hull and the wind moving across the container tops. For the first time in my adult life, I was not going anywhere, and no one was looking for me. The handcuffs were in Voss's pocket. The $47 million was in accounts that no longer existed, in a banking system that no longer functioned. The warrant for my arrest was filed in a courthouse that no one was staffing. Every structure that had defined me, criminal, fugitive, prisoner, required a civilization to enforce, and the civilization was not answering its phone. I was free in a way that tasted exactly like ash. We found the 5th survivor on day 5, and she nearly killed Aurelio with a signal flare. We had spent day 4 completing the main deck, clearing a brutal 8-hour operation that involved Voss and me moving along the exterior walkways, while Aurelio tracked us on CCTV and called out infected positions by radio. The 2 dormant figures on the port side reactivated the moment we descended the exterior stairs, drawn by the sound of our boots on the steel grating. Voss put both down with single shots. I learned 2 things from watching. First, that headshots were necessary, and everything else was decorative. Second, that Voss had fired a weapon at a living human face before. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. Whatever moral architecture supported that capability, she'd built it long before this ship. We sealed the external stairways connecting the main deck to the accommodation block with cargo lashing chains, heavy steel links rated for container loads, padlocked at every access point. The accommodation superstructure became an island, connected to the cargo deck only by routes we controlled. Any infected in the container alleys would stay in the container alleys. Our territory ended where the containers began. On day 5, Queshi finally left the engine control room. He came up through the internal stairwell we'd cleared, emerging on deck 2 like a man surfacing from a submarine. Blinking, disoriented, carrying a toolbox and a half-liter of water he'd been rationing for 3 days. He was Ghanaian, 38, with a mechanical engineer's build and a mechanical engineer's silence. He looked at the 4 of us assembled on the bridge, nodded once, drank the water Aurelio handed him, and said, The number 2 generator has a coolant leak. I need to fix it or we lose electrical in 48 hours. That was his first contribution to the group. No questions about what had happened. No emotional processing, a coolant leak, and a timeline. I liked him immediately. It was during Kwesi's repair operation that afternoon, Aurelio assisting in the engine room while Voss stood guard at the top of the stairwell, that Mrs. Park and I heard the banging from Deck 1. Deck 1 was the lowest level of the accommodation block, partially below the waterline, containing storage compartments, the steering gear room, and a small workshop. We hadn't cleared it. The plan was to seal it from above and leave it until we had more personnel. But the banging was rhythmic and insistent. 3 strikes followed by a pause, followed by 3 strikes, a pattern too regular to be infected movement. I called Voss on the radio. "We have a survivor on Deck 1. Do not open anything. Wait for me. The banging is Morse adjacent. Someone alive is down there." I said wait. I waited. Mrs. Park did not. She walked to the Deck 1 stairwell, unlatched the fire door, and called down in Korean, then English, then Tagalog. "Who is there? Are you hurt?" The banging stopped. A voice came back female, young, hoarse. "I'm in the workshop. I've been in here since Tuesday. Please, I have a child." Mrs. Park looked at me. In her eyes was something I hadn't seen from any of the others. Not calculation, not caution, but an absolute moral clarity that treated the presence of a child as a closed argument. She went down the stairs before I could stop her. I followed, pipe in hand. The Deck 1 corridor was dark. The overhead lights had failed, and the only illumination came from emergency LEDs along the baseboard, casting a red wash that made the steel walls look organic. The workshop was the 3rd door on the right. It was dogged shut from inside. "We're here," Mrs. Park said through the door. "Open when you're ready." The door opened. A signal flare fired outward at chest height. The woman inside had rigged it as a booby trap, tied to the handle with twine, aimed at whatever came through. It missed Mrs. Park by inches and struck the corridor wall behind us, igniting in a shower of phosphorus sparks that burned white hot and set off the overhead smoke detector. I pulled Mrs. Park to the floor. The flare sputtered and died against the wet steel. In the doorway stood a woman, maybe 25, holding a toddler against her chest with one arm and a screwdriver in the other. She was Filipino, thin beyond hunger, wearing a crew uniform 2 sizes too large. The child was 18 months old, silent, watching us with enormous brown eyes that tracked without blinking. Her name was Lena. The child was not hers. Lena had been a cadet, an engine room trainee on her 3rd commercial voyage. The child belonged to the bosun, who had brought his daughter aboard for a short coastal transit because his wife was hospitalized in Houston, and he had no other childcare option. It was a violation of company policy. The captain had allowed it quietly, the way captains have allowed things quietly aboard merchant vessels for as long as there have been merchant vessels. The bosun was one of the first to turn. Lena had grabbed the child from the bosun's cabin when the screaming started and sealed herself in the workshop with a fire axe. 3 liters of water from a utility sink, and a box of dry crackers she'd taken from the galley that morning. She had been in that room for 4 days. The child, whose name was Rosie, had not cried once during the entire confinement. Lena said this calmly, as though it were a logistical detail. I understood later that it was the most frightening thing she'd told us. We brought them to the bridge. Aurelio knew Lena. She'd been in his watch rotation, and his face when he saw her was the first unguarded emotion I'd witnessed from anyone aboard. He said her name, and she said his, and then neither of them spoke for a while. Queshi took one look at the child and left the bridge. He came back 10 minutes later with a blanket and a can of condensed milk he'd found in the engine room stores. And he heated the milk on a portable burner without being asked. We were 7 now. 5 adults and a child, and a toddler who didn't cry. That evening, after Lena had eaten and Rosie had been fed and both were sleeping in the captain's cabin, the rest of us gathered around the chart table and confronted the question that the child had made unavoidable. "We need rules," Mrs. Park said. "Not decisions, rules." I knew what she meant. Decisions are reactive, you make them when something happens. Rules are structural, they preempt what hasn't happened yet. And what hadn't happened yet, but certainly would, was conflict. 6 adults with no shared history, no shared authority, no legal framework, and no external enforcement mechanism were going to disagree about resource allocation, risk tolerance, and territory. A toddler in the equation made every disagreement existential, because a toddler converts abstract resource math into a visible, breathing priority that no one can argue against without sounding monstrous. "Basic structure," Voss said. "Watch rotation, rationing protocol, compartment assignments, rules of engagement for infected contact. Voting protocol," I added. "How decisions get made when we disagree." Voss looked at me. "This isn't a democracy." "It isn't a prison either, not anymore." The silence that followed was different from the boardroom silences I'd known. Those were tactical pauses. This was genuine uncertainty, the kind that arises when people realize they're building something from scratch and every choice establishes precedent. Aurelio broke it. "Majority vote. Except for engine and navigation, those are mine. And medical emergencies, those are Quesi's, until we find someone better." "Security is mine," Voss said. "Food is mine, Mrs. Park said. Everyone looked at me. The criminal, the passenger, the cargo. "What's yours?" Quesi asked, not mocking, genuinely asking. I thought about it. What was mine? I couldn't navigate. I couldn't repair engines. I couldn't cook for 6. I couldn't shoot. What I could do, what I had done my entire life, was look at a complex system and find the places where it leaked. "Waste," I said. "I'll track consumption. Water, fuel, food, medical supplies. I'll run the numbers and tell you when we're lying to ourselves about what's left." Mrs. Park laughed. It was the first laugh I'd heard on the ship, and it was sharp and genuine and directed entirely at me. "A thief counting our money. A thief is exactly who should count it. I know where it disappears." She stopped laughing, but she nodded. And that nod, from the woman who called me boy, who went down a dark stairwell for a stranger's child without waiting for the gun, that nod was the first time I felt like I was aboard this ship rather than merely on it. We drafted the rules that night. 7 provisions, handwritten on the back of a nautical chart, signed by every adult. Majority vote for group decisions. No one enters another's assigned space without announcement. Rationing is calculated by one person and verified by another. Infected contact requires a minimum of 2 people. The child's needs are the first allocation from every shared resource. The radio is monitored continuously, and every person's past before this ship is irrelevant to their standing aboard it. That last rule was mine. Nobody objected. Nobody asked what I needed it for. But Mrs. Park's eyes lingered on me when I wrote it. And in that look was not accusation, but inventory, the quiet cataloging of a woman who understood that a rule requesting amnesty is always written by someone who needs it. 3 weeks passed in a kind of grinding productivity that felt nothing like the stories I'd imagined about the end of the world. There was no dramatic standoff, no desperate last stand, no single moment where everything hung in the balance. There was work. Relentless, mundane, physical work that filled every daylight hour and most of the dark ones. Kwesi fixed the coolant leak and then overhauled the #1 generator as a precaution. He ran the freshwater evaporator at quarter capacity to conserve fuel and calculated that our diesel reserves, at current consumption for electrical generation only, would last 14 months. Aurelio maintained our position using brief engine bursts when the current pushed us too far from the shelf edge. Mrs. Park conducted a complete inventory of the ship's food stores and produced a spreadsheet handwritten on the back of cargo manifests that detailed every can, every sack of rice, every liter of cooking oil. At full rationing for 6 adults and 1 child, we had approximately 8 months of food. I checked her numbers. She was right. She was also conservative. She hadn't counted the cargo. The Capella Star carried 4,200 containers. We didn't know what was in most of them. But the shipping manifests were in the captain's office, and Aurelio and I spent 4 days cross-referencing container numbers against the manifest database on the ship's computer. We found 11 containers of consumer foodstuffs, canned goods, bottled water, dried pasta, pet food. We found 3 containers of medical supplies bound for a hospital chain in Tampico. We found a container of camping equipment, another of automotive parts, and one that, according to the manifest, contained household goods, but which actually held 600 cases of Argentine Malbec. I didn't tell anyone about the wine immediately. I noted it in my ledger and moved on. Some information is leverage, and I hadn't fully stopped being a man who thought about leverage. Voss established security protocols. She welded the external stairway chains with Kwesi's cutting torch, making them permanent. She installed trip lines made from cargo lashing wire on the lower decks, not to trap infected, but to create noise alerts if anything moved below our cleared perimeter. She took inventory of every potential weapon on the ship and was disappointed. A cargo vessel is not an armory. We had her sidearm with 41 remaining rounds, 2 fire axes, a collection of steel pipes and pry bars, and the signal flare gun with 9 flares. She rationed the ammunition as though each round were a small, irreplaceable organ. Lena became Kwesi's apprentice in the engine room, learning the generator systems with the desperate focus of a person who understands that knowledge is the only currency left. Rosie stayed with Mrs. Park during these shifts, and the old woman carried the toddler on her hip while she cooked, narrating every action in Korean as though she were raising the child herself. Rosie still didn't cry. She watched. She watched everything. I did what I'd volunteered to do. I counted. I built a ledger system on the captain's legal pads. Water in, water out, fuel consumed, food eaten, medical supplies used, generator hours, battery charge, radio transmissions monitored. I counted the way I used to count other people's money, with the meticulous attention of a man who knows that what gets measured gets managed, and what gets ignored gets stolen. Every 3 days, I presented the numbers to the group at our evening meeting and answered questions. The numbers were always honest. For the first time in my professional life, every figure in my ledger was real. This was the period I think of as the plateau, the weeks when the Capella Star became, briefly, a functional society. We ate together. We worked together. We argued about small things, watch schedules, shower duration, whether to run the exterior lights at night, and resolved them by vote. We didn't discuss the past. We didn't discuss the future. We existed in operational present tense, maintaining a machine that maintained us. But I was lying to them, and I knew it. The lie wasn't in the numbers were precise. The lie was in what I wasn't counting. I wasn't counting the radio. Or rather, I was monitoring it, logging every transmission we received, every frequency we scanned, and I was not sharing what the monitoring revealed. because what the monitoring revealed was that we were being hunted. The first transmission came on day 12. I was on the midnight radio watch. We'd established 24-hour monitoring, rotating in 4-hour shifts, and I was scanning the VHF bands methodically, logging static, logging silence, logging the occasional automated weather broadcast that still cycled from satellites no one was tending. On channel 72, I caught a voice. Male, American English, controlled, repeating a structured message. Any vessel in the Gulf of Mexico. This is Recovery Group Atlas. We are conducting maritime asset consolidation on behalf of continuity of government operations. Identify your vessel, position, and crew complement. We can offer escort to a secure anchorage. Respond on this channel. I listened through 3 repetitions. The diction was military adjacent. Asset consolidation. Continuity of government. But the delivery was wrong. Military communications follow rigid formatting. This was formatted, but not regulated, like someone who had studied military radio procedure from a manual rather than from a career. I did not respond. I logged the transmission, noted the time and frequency, and said nothing at the morning briefing. On day 16, Atlas broadcast again. Same channel, same voice, but additional information. They named 3 vessels they'd consolidated: a cruise ship, a Coast Guard cutter, and a fishing trawler. They gave a position for their secure anchorage, the mouth of the Mississippi, near the Southwest Pass. They described the anchorage as a protected maritime community with organized defense, medical capability, and agricultural development on Barrier Island territory. It sounded perfect. It sounded precisely as perfect as a thing designed to sound perfect. And I had spent my career designing things that sounded perfect, building prospectuses and pitch decks and projected return models that sparkled with promise and concealed the structural emptiness behind the numbers. I knew what persuasion tasted like when it was manufactured, because I had manufactured it. I still said nothing. On day 22, Aurelio intercepted the same broadcast during his watch. He brought it up at the evening meeting. "There's an organized group at the Mississippi Delta," he said. "They're offering safe harbor. They have a military vessel." Everyone looked at me, not because they suspected I knew, but because I was the one who monitored the radio log. And a systematic man should have caught this. "I heard it 10 days ago," I said. The table went quiet. "You heard it," Voss said, "and didn't report it." "I didn't report it because I don't trust it." "That wasn't your call." "Every broadcast I've logged is in the ledger. I noted it. I didn't suppress it. I chose not to advocate for a response." "Those are the same thing," Aurelio said. His voice was different now, not angry, but recalibrated. The way a navigator recalibrates when he discovers the chart he's been using has an error. "You decided for us." "I decided to gather more information before presenting an option I believe is dangerous." "Dangerous based on what?" Quaishi asked. "Based on the fact that anyone broadcasting an open invitation to all vessels in the Gulf is not running a rescue operation. They're running a collection operation. Ships are the most valuable asset left in the world right now. Fuel, cargo, steel, mechanical systems. Every vessel is a floating warehouse. Atlas isn't offering refuge. They're acquiring a fleet." Mrs. Park set her spoon down. She looked at Rosie, asleep in the portable crib Lena had built from a storage bin and blankets. She looked at me. "You hid this because you believe it. You may be right, but you hid it." She paused. "A thief decides alone what others should know. That is how you got on this ship in the first place." The sentence landed in my sternum like a nail-driven flush. She was right. She was exactly right. I had withheld information from the group based on my private assessment of its danger, and in doing so, I had replicated the exact behavioral pattern that had gotten $47 million stolen from people who trusted my judgment. I had appointed myself the arbiter of what others deserved to know. The vote that followed was 4-1 to respond to Atlas and request more information. Voss, Aurelio, Quese, and Lena voted yes. I voted no. Mrs. Park abstained, watching me as she did. Aurelio transmitted our response the next morning. He identified us as a cargo vessel with 6 crew and a child, gave no position, and requested details about the anchorage. The reply came within an hour, faster than any legitimate rescue coordination I could imagine. Atlas provided coordinates, described their perimeter defenses, listed the vessels already in their group, now 5, and asked for our cargo manifest. Our cargo manifest. Not our medical needs, not our crew condition, our cargo. I wrote that detail in the ledger in red ink and said nothing more about it. The crisis came on day 31, and it came from inside, not outside. We'd been stationary for nearly 4 weeks. The plateau had ended not with drama, but with erosion, the slow grinding of 6 adults living in a space designed for transit, not habitation. The arguments had gotten smaller and sharper. Who left the galley lights on, whose watch ran 30 seconds short, whether the remaining coffee should be rationed or eliminated. The arguments were never about the coffee. They were about the fact that 6 people who had not chosen each other were discovering that shared survival does not produce shared affection, and that the absence of external threat didn't eliminate conflict, it redistributed it inward. Voss and I had settled into a pattern I recognized from my marriage. Functional cooperation underlaid by permanent distrust. She never forgot what I was. Every time I presented numbers, she audited them. Every time I made a suggestion, she interrogated the motive. She was right to do this. I was a convicted fraudster, or would have been, if courts still convened. But the vigilance was exhausting for both of us, and it created a secondary effect I hadn't anticipated. It made the others choose sides. Aurelio and Lena trusted me, not because I'd earned it, but because I'd been right about Atlas. And being right about a threat creates a credit line that persists even when the specific prediction hasn't been confirmed. Mrs. Park trusted Voss, or rather, she trusted the gun, which amounted to the same thing. Quasi trusted the engine, which trusted no one. The fracture opened when Aurelio proposed moving the ship. He'd been tracking radio traffic from the Yucatan coast Mexican Navy vessels operating a quarantine perimeter off Campeche. The broadcasts were structured, professional, and verifiable against known call signs. Unlike Atlas, these were institutional signals from a military that appeared to still function. Aurelio wanted to steam south and make contact. Mexico has a functioning government, he said at the evening meeting. The Yucatan is maintaining a coastal barrier. If we present ourselves as a merchant vessel seeking refuge, international maritime law requires them to offer assistance. International maritime law requires a lot of things that aren't happening anymore, I said. This is different. These are Navy ships, real ones. And what happens when they board us and find a cargo manifest worth $200 million in commercial goods? They impound the ship. They take the cargo. They resettle us in a refugee camp on a coast we can't leave. We go from owning a fortress to owning nothing. We don't own this ship, Voss said. We occupy it. In the current legal environment, that's the same thing. There is no current legal environment. That's the point. Exactly. Which is why we should not voluntarily submit to someone else's. The vote was 3-3. Aurelio, Lena, and Voss wanted to go south. Mrs. Park, Quasi, and I wanted to stay. A tie, under our rules, meant no action. Aurelio accepted it. Lena did not. She came to me that night on the bridge wing where I was running numbers by flashlight. Rosie was asleep in the carrier strapped to Lena's chest. The young woman had become the child's primary caregiver so seamlessly that the transition felt biological rather than circumstantial. "You're keeping us here because you're afraid," she said. "I'm keeping us here because the math works." The math works until it doesn't. Fuel runs out, food runs out. The generators fail. What then? Then we adapt. We fish. We collect rainwater. We repair what breaks. You're describing a prison, a floating prison where you're the warden. I'm describing a platform where no one can reach us and we control our own resources. You're describing what you had before they caught you. She said it without cruelty, a statement of structural observation, the kind an engineer makes about a load-bearing wall. You built a system on land where you controlled the information and the money and the access. It collapsed. Now you're building the same system on water. I didn't answer. Rosie shifted in the carrier, and Lena adjusted the strap without looking down, her hands moving with the practiced automation of someone who had been carrying this weight long enough for it to become part of her body's default geometry. "I'm not going to undermine the vote," she said. "But you should know Aurelio and I have been talking. If this ship becomes a place where one person's fear overrides everyone's future, we'll take a lifeboat and go south ourselves." She left. I stayed on the bridge wing and looked at the numbers in my ledger. 14 months of fuel, 8 months of food, 6 adults, 1 child. The numbers were correct. They'd been correct every day since I started counting. But Lena had identified the variable I wasn't tracking. The math only worked if nobody left. Atlas found us on day 39, not by radio, by sight. A vessel appeared on radar at 0600. A large return, moving northeast at 12 knots, on a course that would bring it within 5 miles of our position. Aurelio identified it from the bridge as a car carrier, a roll-on/roll-off ship, high-sided, roughly our length, painted dark gray with no visible name or port of registry. It was not broadcasting on AIS, the automatic identification system that all commercial vessels are required to operate. A ship that size running without AIS was either damaged or hiding. It altered course toward us at 0615. Voss was on the bridge within minutes. Queshi started the main engine without being asked, the first time it had run in 3 weeks. The Capella star vibrated back to life, and the sound of it, after all those weeks of silence, felt like a body remembering how to breathe. "Can we outrun them?" Voss asked. "Not a chance," Aurelio said. "Car carriers make 18 knots. We make 14 fully loaded." The radio crackled. Channel 16. A male voice, the same voice I'd heard on day 12. "Cargo vessel on my bow, this is Recovery Group Atlas. We've been trying to reach you. Please identify and reduce speed for rendezvous." Voss looked at me. For the first time since I'd come aboard in handcuffs, her expression held no contempt. It held the tight, compressed focus of a person who has just been proven wrong about something she'd staked credibility on, and who does not have time to process that debt before the next decision demands payment. "You were right," she said. 2 words. Everything they contained, she left unpacked. It doesn't matter if I was right. What matters is whether we can run. "We can't run," Aurelio said. "We can maneuver, but they'll close the gap in 2 hours. Then we don't run. We negotiate." I turned to Voss. How many rounds? 36. They don't know that. They don't know how many we are. They don't know what we're carrying. All they know is what we tell them on the radio. I picked up the handset. I hadn't transmitted once in 39 days. My voice on Channel 16 would be new, unknown, untrackable, unattached to any previous communication they'd intercepted. I keyed the mic. Atlas, this is the vessel on your bow. We are a United States government asset operating under federal maritime authority. We are armed and we are not available for consolidation. Alter course and maintain a minimum distance of 5 nautical miles, or we will consider your approach hostile. Acknowledge. Silence. 10 seconds. 20. The voice came back, lighter now, amused. Government asset. That's creative. We've boarded 6 government assets in the last month. The governments weren't on any of them. Last chance, identify your cargo and crew complement, and we'll make this easy. I looked at Voss. She was already moving. She took the flare gun from the emergency cabinet, walked to the bridge wing, and fired a red signal flare in a high arc toward the approaching vessel. It burst at 500 feet, visible for miles, a searing point of crimson light that hung in the morning sky. What does that accomplish? Aurelio asked. Nothing, Voss said, but it tells them we're not hiding. The car carrier slowed. It didn't stop, but it reduced speed. And for 20 minutes, it held a parallel course 3 miles to our east, pacing us. I could see figures on its deck through Aurelio's binoculars, a dozen, maybe more, moving with the organized purpose of people accustomed to boarding operations. Then Quasi's voice came over the internal phone from the engine room. I can give you black smoke. I didn't understand. Aurelio did. He grabbed the phone. How much? Enough to look like a fire. I bypass the exhaust scrubber and run the engine rich. Black smoke, thick, visible from 10 miles. It'll look like we're burning. Aurelio looked at me. I looked at Voss. Voss looked at the car carrier on the horizon. Do it, she said. 2 minutes later, the Capella star's funnel erupted in a column of dense black smoke that climbed into the clear Gulf sky like a signal from a world that was finished with being quiet. From 3 miles away, it would look like a catastrophic engine room. Fire, a ship dying, a prize no longer worth the boarding risk. The car carrier watched for 40 minutes. Then it turned north and accelerated. By noon, it was gone from radar. Quasi cleared the exhaust and shut down the bypass. The smoke dissipated. The sky returned to blue. We were alone again, but the shape of our aloneness had changed. We were no longer a vessel avoiding the world. We were a vessel the world had come looking for. The meeting that night was the longest we'd held. 4 hours. No one raised their voice. That was how I knew it was serious. The arguments that matter most are conducted at conversational volume, because everyone understands that volume would break something that can't be repaired. The question was binary: stay or move. Atlas knew our approximate position. They'd be back with more preparation and better tactics. The open Gulf, which had been our moat, was now our exposure, a flat, featureless surface where any vessel with radar could find us. We needed to reposition, and repositioning required a destination. Aurelio argued for Mexico. Lena supported him. The Yucatan broadcasts were still active, the quarantine perimeter still holding. A functioning navy was the only reliable protection against Atlas-type predation. Voss argued for the open Atlantic. East, away from every coast, into deep ocean where fuel costs would eventually strand us, but where no one would follow. A death by arithmetic rather than assault. Kwesi argued for the Caribbean. Island chains offered anchorages where a large vessel could hide in coastal geography, using shallow water and reef systems as natural barriers against larger ships. Mrs. Park didn't argue. She fed Rosie mashed canned peaches and watched the rest of us perform our various calculations, as though she were watching children argue about a game whose rules they hadn't agreed on. I argued for something none of them expected. "We surfaced the cargo," I said. "All of it. Every container we've inventoried. We open them, we catalog the contents, and we broadcast what we have on an open channel. Not to Atlas, to everyone. We tell the Gulf of Mexico that the Capella Star is a floating supply depot, available for trade. We invite contact, we set the terms." Aurelio stared at me. "You want to advertise?" "I want to create a market. Right now we're a target because we're a mystery, a cargo ship with unknown contents. Atlas wants us because they don't know what we're carrying, and anything is valuable. If we publish the manifest, we control the narrative. We become a known quantity. We trade food for fuel, medical supplies for mechanical parts, information for alliance. We stop being a fortress and become a port." "A port attracts ships," Voss said, "including the ones we don't want. A fortress that can't run also attracts ships. At least a port sets the terms of engagement. You want to turn a survival situation into a transaction." Voss's voice was flat, but not hostile. She was testing the structure, pressing on the joints to see if they held. "Every survival situation is a transaction. We're transacting right now labor for safety, compliance for community, ammunition for authority. I'm proposing we expand the market beyond this deck." Mrs. Park put down the spoon. Rosie reached for it. Mrs. Park let her take it. "The man who stole $47 million wants to open a store," Mrs. Park said. The air left the room. Lena looked at me. Aurelio looked at Voss. Kwesi looked at the deck. "You knew," I said to Mrs. Park. It wasn't a question. I knew before they took the cuffs off. A woman my age learns to recognize a man being transported. "You weren't crew, you weren't passenger, you were freight." She looked at Voss. I assumed the marshal would explain when it mattered. It matters now. Voss said nothing. Her hand didn't move toward her weapon. But I could feel the geometry of the room reorganize around the disclosure. Every body shifting its weight, every gaze recalculating the distance between itself and me. $47 million, Aurelio said. Dollars? Wire fraud. 14 months as a fugitive. I was arrested in Kema and put on this ship for transport to arraignment in Corpus Christi. I kept my voice level. The same voice I'd used in pitch meetings. The same voice I'd used to lie. Everything I've done on this ship, the numbers, the ledger, the rationing, the Atlas warning, I did while being a man who stole $47 million from people who trusted him. That's the fact. The question is whether the fact changes the math. Lena spoke first. It doesn't. The math is either right or it isn't. Who did it doesn't change whether the food lasts 8 months. It changes whether we trust the person reading the numbers, Kwesi said quietly. Then audit every figure I've produced. I've wanted that since the beginning. Voss has been doing it since week 1. Put a second pair of eyes on every number going forward. But don't pretend the numbers are wrong, because the man who wrote them is. The vote happened at midnight. Not on my trade proposal that was tabled for later. The vote was on me. Whether I stayed on the ship as a full member of the group or was confined to quarters under Voss's authority for the remainder of our time aboard. The tally was 3-2 to keep me free. Lena, Aurelio, and Kwesi voted to maintain my status. Voss voted to confine. Mrs. Park voted to confine. I looked at Mrs. Park. She met my eyes without apology. "I trust your numbers," she said. "I don't trust your hands. A man who hides a radio transmission will hide other things. You stay free because the others say so. But I'm watching you, boy. Every day." We moved south on day 41. Not to Mexico, the vote for a destination had landed on a compromise. We would approach the Yucatan quarantine perimeter, establish contact, and negotiate from international waters before committing to entry. If the terms were unacceptable, we'd turn east toward the Caribbean. If the terms were fair, we'd accept inspection, and whatever came with it. I spent the 2-day transit organizing the cargo inventory for broadcast. Aurelio helped me format it as a standardized maritime commercial communication vessel name, position, cargo categories, willingness to trade, terms of approach. We transmitted it on multiple VHF channels and on HF radio, which carried farther. Within hours, we received 3 responses: a fishing fleet operating out of Ciudad del Carmen, a tanker anchored off Isla Mujeres, and a voice I didn't recognize who asked only about the medical supplies and offered diesel at a rate that suggested they had more fuel than they could use and less medicine than they needed. The market opened. Over the next week, while Aurelio navigated us south along the shelf edge, I conducted 7 radio trades. I negotiated with people I'd never see for goods I'd never touch, establishing exchange rates for a post-currency economy using the only skill I actually possessed, the ability to assign value to things and persuade others to accept my valuation. It was exactly what I'd done at the firm. The only difference was that every number I quoted was real. Mrs. Park watched every transaction. She sat beside me at the radio console with her arms crossed, listening to my negotiations the way a parole officer watches a parolee's first day at a new job, not expecting failure, not hoping for success, simply witnessing. On the 3rd trade, 5 cases of antibiotics for 200 liters of diesel, delivered by a panga that came alongside at dawn. Mrs. Park spoke for the first time during a negotiation. "Tell them we'll include multivitamins, 12 bottles, no extra charge." I looked at her. That's a concession with no return. A fishing fleet with no vitamins will get scurvy. Scurvy fishermen can't fish. Fishermen who can't fish can't trade with us next month. Include the vitamins. I included the vitamins. The fishing fleet's captain, a woman named Dolores, responded with a long silence, and then offered to throw in 40 kilos of fresh-caught grouper. We ate grilled fish that night for the first time since boarding. Mrs. Park didn't say she approved, but she ate the fish, and she served me first. We made visual contact with the Mexican Navy on day 49. 2 patrol vessels intercepted us at the edge of the quarantine zone, 15 miles north of the Yucatan coast. They were professional, cautious, and armed in ways that made Voss's SIG Sour look like a historical artifact. A boarding team of 6 Marines came aboard, conducted a health screening, inspected the ship, and spoke to each of us individually. When they reached me, I told them who I was and what I'd done. The officer taking my statement wrote it down without visible reaction and asked if I had any medical complaints. Voss turned over her weapon voluntarily. She turned over the handcuffs, too. The Marine officer looked at them, looked at me, and put them in an evidence bag that I suspect went into a drawer that no one ever opened again. They offered us 3 options: anchor in a designated quarantine zone for 30 days and then enter a refugee processing center on shore, transfer to a naval vessel for relocation to a consolidated settlement, or remain aboard our vessel under Mexican Maritime Authority, operating as a registered trade platform within the quarantine perimeter. We voted. It was unanimous for the first time. We stayed on the ship. The Capella Star anchored 2 miles off the coast of Campeche in 60 feet of clear water on day 50. We could see the shore green, alive, patrolled, organized. We could see other vessels at anchor, a growing cluster of ships that had made the same calculation we had. We could hear organized radio traffic, schedules, supply coordination, the mundane communications of a society that was functioning because people had decided to make it function. Rosie said her first word that day. She pointed at the water from Mrs. Park's arms and said, "Blue." Not crying, not distressed. An observation. The world was blue, and she was naming it. That evening, I went to Mrs. Park on the galley deck where she was preparing dinner. I set the ledger on the counter, every page, every number, 50 days of meticulous accounting. "Audit it," I said. "All of it. Before we integrate with anyone, you should know that every figure is accurate." She opened the ledger. She turned the first page, then the second. She read slowly, running her finger beneath each line, the way a person reads a document they intend to memorize. "I never thought the numbers were wrong," she said without looking up. "Then why did you vote to confine me?" "Because a man who is honest with numbers and dishonest with people is more dangerous than the reverse. Numbers don't forgive. People can." She closed the ledger and handed it back. "I forgive you, boy. Now set the table." I live on the Capella Star. I've lived here for I don't know how long. The dates in my ledger continue, but the months have lost the weight they used to carry. Mrs. Park manages the galley and the morale. Kwesi keeps the generators alive. Aurelio navigates when we need to reposition within the anchorage. Voss works with the Mexican naval detachment that oversees the quarantine fleet. Lena is studying engineering through a radio correspondence course with a professor in Merida. Rosie is talking in full sentences now and calls me Leo. I still count. Every day. Every resource in and out. Every trade logged. Every number honest. It's the only restitution available to me, the daily, voluntary accuracy that no one requires, but everyone relies on. Sometimes at night, I sit on the bridge wing and look at the other ships at anchor. Their lights scattered across the dark water like a broken constellation. I think about the $47 million. I think about the accounts that no longer exist in the banking system, that no longer functions. I think about the people I stole from their faces I never saw, their losses I never counted. I can't give it back. I can't stand trial. I can't be sentenced. So I count what's real instead. And I give the numbers to people who can use them. And I set the table when Mrs. Park tells me to. And I answer to boy from a woman who saw through me on the first day and decided to let me stay anyway. The ship doesn't move much. The world comes to us now. That's enough.